I'm joined today by Mr. Ángel Gurría, who has been the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development since 2006. An economist and a diplomat of Mexican origin, Mr. Gurría has previously served on the UN Secretary General's Global Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, and in various positions within the Mexican government. Mr. Gurría, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's very, very exciting to be speaking to you this morning.
Thank you.
I wanted to start off by talking about how you qualified to be where you are today, and your early career, early life. So you got your bachelor's degree in economics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and then you did your postgraduate at the University of Leeds in the UK, and then at Harvard University. How has this international education affected your economics and your worldview?
Well, it was mostly in Leeds. In Harvard University, I took some courses, but not the degree. Let me say that the international part of my vocation came through a number of ways. And one was that very early in my, when I was a child, actually, my mother got me some French classes, and I already spoke English because I was going to bilingual school. And then the same teacher who taught us French, after a couple of years, started teaching us Italian. And then the same teacher, after a couple of years of teaching Italian, started teaching us German. And so the question of the languages and the question of the world out there, it became second nature to me. I grew up with it. Because we were reading in all these languages and we were playing in all these languages and we were doing some little theater pieces and things like that, and that you use for teaching. So that came, and then my first formal job. I say this because I had a number of teenage jobs, and I was an office boy, and then I was carry produce out of a supermarket for ladies and get little tips. And then I got I got a job as a page boy in Hilton Hotel in Mexico City. But my first formal job was in the financial department of the Federal Electricity Commission. And it happened to be that the financial department had links with the World Bank, had links with the Inter-American Development Bank, had links with a number of suppliers of equipment, but also of the financial side, the export credit side of the countries. So France or Spain or the UK or Germany or Italy or whatever. So for me, the question of dealing on finance and then internationally, and then I would travel with the bosses because I was mostly a translator. I thought I was a great financier at the time, and I felt like I was a very sophisticated person. But mostly I was doing some translation. But in the meantime, of course, picking all these things up and learning a lot. And I was only 17 then, so it kind of, it just came quite naturally because of the choices, but both my parents, but also I did professionally, and then just picked it up from there.
Could you talk to us a bit about your early work in Mexico with organizations such as the International Coffee Organization, and then the work you did in the 1980s restructuring foreign debt?
After I worked in the Federal Electricity Commission in the financial department, and because I was familiar with these issues, etc., we moved. And I say we moved because the whole team, there was a big political change, the government changed. We all moved to the National Development Bank, NAFINSA, where again, I was in the financial side, mostly on the international side. And then what happened is that from there, I went off to Leeds University to do my master's degree. Then when we came back, I joined the Ministry of Finance. And I joined the Ministry of Finance in the debt area, obviously in the international, foreign debt area, where I rose to be the head of that area, and then eventually deputy minister, and at some point in time became the minister of finance. Not in a single sequence, there was off and on. I was head of the National Development Bank myself, where I started working, at the very beginning. I then became head of that. I became head of the Export-Import Bank. But when I was the directeur du Trésor, the equivalent to that, which was the director of public credit, it was called. That's when I had to renegotiate Mexico's foreign debt. And I have to say that it was an appropriate penalty for me, because I was the one who had actually contracted the debt. I was the one who had negotiated the debt. I was the one who had actually, in those days, Mexico was a very attractive debtor, and we did not have a crisis, and we were competing with the Swedes, and we were competing with the Belgians and whoever, to see who got the best conditions. And then, of course, we did run into problems because we borrowed too much, and because there was a problem of subsequent deficits in Mexico. That there were just, so public finances were wrong. I was not responsible for that, but I was the one who had to kind of fill in the holes. There were big gaps that were created. So it said, Gurría, get us a little bit more foreign debt, and eventually it became too much. And there was a time of reckoning, and we had to, from 82 to 1990, there was a whole decade of successive renegotiations, and then one final renegotiation. And we've never looked back after that, but it was a very painful experience. We all learned a lot about what we should do or what not to do, and at the same time to use foreign resources, foreign loans, very prudently, very carefully. They can make you or help you advance the projects in a particular country. They can make you advance development, but at the same time, they can be a very great source of, if you abuse the use of simply because you have access, if you abuse it, then it can turn into a boomerang and come back and affect you, like was the case of Mexico. So we spent a long time trying to recover from this overhang of debt. Mm-hmm. Again, it was very painful, and we learned a lot of lessons, and hopefully it won't happen again.
So you talked about everything that you learned in this process in terms of fiscal responsibility and so on. Did you pick up as well any skills or any qualifications as a negotiator throughout this process?
Well, as I said, it happened naturally, because by 17, I was participating in very high-level negotiations in Europe, in either in French or in English or in Italian or whatever it was, but mostly being the translator, but then listening to my bosses, who were the ones who were who were doing the negotiation in earnest. And of course, I thought I was a very important participant, but I really wasn't. And then when it was my turn to do it, I didn't need translators, but so that helped me put in perspective my own development. But what happened is that you listen to these people. You listen to the people who are responsible. You listen to the bankers. You listen to the heads of the export credit agencies. You listen to the investment bankers about the bond issues that you are emitting. Let me tell you a very short story here. I was 18 And I was working in the Federal Electricity Commission, and I was translating a prospectus to sell bonds, to promote and sell bonds in Europe, in European units of account. Now, this is this is like the great-grandfather of the euro today, or the great-great-great-grandfather of the euro. And I'm talking about 50 years ago. I'm talking about, so there was this idea that there could be a common currency. Already there was this idea that the Europeans had something in common that was more than just the geography. And there were attempts to create a common currency in which, bonds were being expressed in those units, and at the same time they were being sold to investors, and the investors were buying bonds denominated in European units of account. I remember we had to come out in those days with 14 different currencies just to calculate the payments of interest every quarter, every 6 months. But what I mean is, it also gave this idea. We said, what are they trying to do? What is this about? What is Europe about? What is, and the one single currency for all these countries? So again, it happened that I kind of tripped over this because I was helping the people in the financial department of the Federal Electricity Commission do this prospectus. I used the telex. The telex. You won't even know. You need to go to a museum these days in order to know what a telex was. But it was very slow, and you had to perforate, in order to send messages, in order to send text. It was, again, it was more than 50 years ago, so you can imagine.
Moving now to your experiences in the UN Secretary General's Global Advisory Board on Water and Sanitation, what were the most substantial lessons you took away from the UN as an organization, and where do you see the UN's place in the world today?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that this was mostly about water. The issue that brought me to this group was water. And there were two precedents. One was the Camdessus, meaning Michel Camdessus, the former head of the IMF, a very important pillar of the financial community of the world still today. He invited me to be in a task force about financing water for all. Okay, so there were, about 20 people around in this group, very distinguished people, some of them financiers, some people who were dealing with water issues, some people who were experts in other areas related. So then when this group delivered its report, Mr. Camdessus actually was called by President Chirac to do something about Africa or whatever, and he actually delivered the group to me. So after that, it was called the Gurría Task Force. And the Gurría Task Force produced yet another report about how to deal with the water issues, et cetera. We would report typically for the World Water Council meetings, which happen every 3 years. So the first one was delivered in Kyoto. The second one was delivered in Mexico City. And I was already the head of that group. And only after that did that group turn into the United Nations Secretary General Advisory Group on Water and Sanitation. But the nucleus, the core, was Camdessus group originally, and then my group that worked on these water issues. I was always very interested in the water issue. I was basically, obsessed with water. I come from a country that has a lot of water in the south, not too much water in the center, and practically no water in the north. So we're very aware of the importance of water. And of course, I have to say in the beginning, not a lot of people were very interested. Now everybody is aware of the problem. But so when you ask me about this specialized group, we first were chaired by a gentleman called Ryutaro Hashimoto. Ryutaro Hashimoto had been the environment minister, but had been the prime minister of Japan. He's also been finance minister and, you know, a number of other positions. But anyway, he was our chairman. He was already retired. And actually, we worked a lot with him. We opened, he would open a lot of doors and he would work very hard. And so we produced a number of reports and produced a number of proposals. And we would deliver them to the Secretary General of the United Nations, and then he would pass them on. He would present them as his, you know, the UN's proposals. And that also helped. Now, Ryutaro Hashimoto unfortunately passed away while he was chair. And then we had another very great success, that because Willem Alexander, the then heir to the crown of the Netherlands, to the crown of Orange, he was our chair. And it happens to be that, of course, the Dutch are absolutely invested and involved in the question of water. Every one of them is aware of this thing. We worked very, very hard, and he worked just as hard as we did. I mean, didn't even look like a royal, you know, he was just working. He'd come with us, and he was fantastic. Problem, he was then promoted. He became the king. And therefore, you know, he had to let go. And then the group eventually was dissolved. But what happened is that because of this inspiration about the water, because of all this work, since I arrived to the OECD, and that's already in 2006, I said the OECD is going to be working on the question of water as one of its main issues. And I actually said, they asked me, okay, when they were looking for the candidates and seeing which candidate was more appropriate, whatever, they said, what would you have as a priority if you were ahead of the OECD? And I said, I would have as a priority health, second, migration, and third, water. And people understood why I wanted health. Not everybody was very convinced about migration, but nobody understood why I wanted to have water as one of the biggest issues. You know, they thought it was going to put jobs or employment or something like that. Of course, we do that. Or education, we do that all the time. But I wanted to signal new elements there. And that was water. And that came from my inspiration from these working groups and also from the UN. Now, you asked me, what do I think about the UN? Let me tell you what I say about the OECD regarding the UN. I say that there are some things in which the OECD aims and would like to get the Oscar. The Oscar for, you know, for best movie, the Oscar for best actor, the Oscar for best director, you know, just to be number one, you know, this, whether it's in taxation issues or whether it's in education issues or whatever it is. We want to be, you know, good at the things we do and therefore have a natural leadership on these issues. But I also say that when it comes to the UN and when we work with the UN and for the UN, we aim for the Oscar for best supporting cast, which means we recognize the UN not only has the leadership, but it is an institution that has no peer, that it's an institution that absolutely is indispensable. And I have to say also, the reason why I became so familiar with the UN is because before being finance minister, I was actually for 3 years, I was foreign minister of Mexico. And of course, the UN was second nature to a foreign minister. I remember one of the first things I had to do when I arrived as when I was appointed as foreign minister, simply because the calendar was there, you know, it had to be done, is that I had to give a big speech about how do we get rid of nuclear arms, nuclear disarmament. You know, this is, and of course, I had all my career in the financial and economic areas, and that's why my boss, the president Cedillo at that time, actually asked me to become foreign minister, because he wanted me to make the foreign office, the foreign ministry, more oriented towards promotion and towards investments and towards financial issues, etc., and economic issues, without, of course, neglecting the political issues and the bilateral relations, etc. So what happened is that I didn't really know very much about that. In fact, I knew very little, and I was there a few days after being appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs in the highest podium of mankind, you know, in the United Nations, giving a speech about something I knew quite little at that time, and on disarmament and nuclear power and all that. And of course, Mexico had a tradition of, actually, Mexico had a Nobel Prize for Peace because it promoted the fact that there should be nuclear disarmament in Latin America, the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And of course, so Mexico had a big, had a big axe to grind. It had a big thing to say about it. And I remember that specifically. But so the UN for me is not only indispensable, the UN is an institution we would have to support, that we have to listen to, and that also requires not only that we support it politically, it requires that we support it financially, and it requires that we give it the necessary, the wherewithal to be able to deliver on its many, many responsibilities. There's no other institution like that. There is no other institution that can do its job. So that is why when it comes to working for the UN in our areas, either on water or on things like the SDGs, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, or on debt issues, on economics, whatever it is, we are a great supporter, and as I say, we aim to have the Oscar for best supporting cast.
To go back then to your work on the with the OECD, you talked about these 3 priorities that you had when you first took office. What work do you think you've done towards these priorities, and what is your most proudest achievement with the OECD?
Well, let me say first that my priorities then were health, migration, and water. If I had to do it all over again today, and if I were looking for the job, I'd probably say, health and migration and water. Maybe if they give me a 4th one, I would say all the digital, if they give me a 5th one, I would say the question of inequalities, because there's a big question of inequalities, and the crisis, the financial crisis, just exacerbated these inequalities. But it's difficult to rank health against education, or education against inequalities, or inequalities against climate change. I would say today, climate. I would say, this is our single most important intergenerational responsibility today. Except that right now we're fighting a pandemic. And the question is, we run the danger because of the pandemic to distract ourselves. Now, it's not that the pandemic is a distraction. It's too important for that. It's too dramatic. It's causing too much damage. It's causing too many deaths. It's causing too many people sick, and then it's causing too many unemployed. It's causing too many small and medium enterprises to close, and very large enterprises to tourism, hospitality, etc., etc. It's dramatic. However, we should fight with everything we got against the pandemic, but not lose sight of the medium and long-term and very long-term challenges that we face. And I would say, if you say, okay, choose one, I'd say, of course, the climate change.
One of the things I wanted to touch on in terms of challenges facing development today is this rise of authoritarianism in developing and developed world countries around the world. What do you think the OECD can do to respond to this trend?
There's a very great discontent, also widespread discontent in the world. We call it the geography of discontent. And there are several reasons. One is the crisis itself. The crisis was very tough. It destroyed tens of millions of jobs. And this is also why this particular crisis now with the COVID is so dangerous, again, because it comes on top of, we were just recovering and then suddenly this happens. But then there's a question of the policies. If you focus only on policies about growth and productivity, rather than in having people, get back on the bandwagon, if you will, because you left so many people out during the crisis. If you don't get them back, if you don't help them to have a chance to level the playing field, if you don't empower them, they will become disaffected, they will become discontent. And then, in the best of cases, they will show their discontent in the polls, in the votes, in the voting booths, in the best of cases. But sometimes they may not go to the polls, or they may choose to move away from the democratic process because they believe the democratic process is not delivering for them. Or, of course, in the extreme, when you have people who go off and become big offenders to society and become, violent, or just take, take the wrong path. So I'll give you what I often quote as a very bad case, where perhaps if people had a better opinion of democracy, or had a better feel for what democracy could do for them, the results would have been different. And that's on Brexit. 60% of the youth whose future was at stake did not vote in the Brexit. When, all the young people wanted to be Europeans, they wanted to be citizens of the world, etc. And they're the ones who didn't go out and vote. And they left it to the ones who didn't care less, and then what happened? Well, we lost, and I say we lost because I fought really hard. Now, as head of the OECD, my responsibility is the people spoke, and now we have to make it happen. The long process of negotiation is about to expire. Hopefully we'll have a deal. And then, of course, we have to make it as seamless and as smooth as possible, because it was the people's will. But what if, we've had a greater participation? Well, I don't know exactly what would have happened, but at least, it would have been more democratic in that sense, because more turnout is always better for democracy. But why did all these, young people say, well, not for me, it's not something where not my axe to grind. Well, basically it was.
Mm.
And I'm sure that many of them now regret it.
Turning now to a slightly different issue, I wanted to ask about how you think the developing world economies, particularly countries in Africa, growing countries in Africa, are shaping the picture of development today, and what impact do you think the virus is going to have on their development?
The question of developing countries starts with the impact that the crisis had in the developing countries already 12 years ago, where in the beginning it looked like they were navigating through the crisis better, didn't have the same impact. And then slowly it got to them by indirect ways, which is trade and commodities and investments. And of course, everybody was trying to get out of this doldrums and this very, the bad situation with the slowdown, etc. And then suddenly this happens. Now, it's a very serious problem that we have now. And I recently wrote an op-ed with Achim Steiner, who is the head of the UNDP, warning the world about the fact that this, we had a great challenge in the developed economies of the world, in the OECD, but we had to stop this from becoming a tragedy in the developing world. And that includes Africa, but also includes Latin America, includes Southeast Asia, includes, every country where there are pockets of poor people that are, below the line and that they're struggling. And you have a number of things. First of all, the debt. After 10 years of very low interest and of increasing access by countries to debt. I mean, you even have a number of African countries which had access to bond markets, and they borrowed the money and they borrowed from the export credit agencies to buy equipment, or sometimes just to buy things in general, sometimes consumption items. They borrowed from China. China has become a very important creditor to the world. Just like it has grown in terms of its weight on trade and investment, it also grew as a promoter, creditor to all these countries. So they would lend for projects, for large projects, infrastructure, etc., equipment, etc. So you basically had a number of areas and a number of sources which, made it kind of easy to work on the debt. And, when, again, my own background, knowing that the debt can be there, that it can be at a good price, but please don't abuse it, because then there'll be a time of reckoning. You have a situation today where countries, and that's developed and developing, companies, non-financial companies, and even households have a lot of debt. Now, wasn't that what we wanted them to do? Yes, exactly. Wasn't that why we had such low interest rates? Yes, so that they would use the money and, borrow the money and use it for consumption, for investments and infrastructure, etc. So in a sense, what happened is a success story, but the problem is you can have too much of a success. And suddenly you have this situation where, on top of this high indebtedness, suddenly comes the COVID, and then it's a shock of supply, because the global value chains were broken. Some value chains that start in Vietnam or in China or in Mexico or whatever, they're no longer possible when you don't have transportation, you don't have, you have closure of borders, etc. But then it was a dramatic demand shock, because people are losing as we speak. You know, they're losing their jobs by the millions, by the tens of millions. And countries have to come up with these huge, you know, support systems, support packages, bailouts, whatever, in order to help them and in order to attenuate the impact. So when you're talking about developing countries, they don't have the same financial firepower, and they don't have the same infrastructure of health, for example. You know, we're discussing whether Germany has more beds per capita than Italy, or that Italy has more beds per capita than France, or whatever it is. But basically, these are, you know, the richest countries in the world. And even if they have deficits, they can pick them up and they can compensate for them pretty fast. Hopefully, there should be more international cooperation, because that would make things easier. But in the developing countries, you don't have this situation. You have very fragile or very vulnerable health systems. There's some countries in which you have 7 respirators, you know, things like that. It's crazy. It just and what is an intensive care unit? Well, it's a bed with a respirator, you know, and if you don't have the respirator, then it's simply a bed, and then it will help people die, you know, rather than help people live. It's terrible. It's terrible. It's a very dramatic situation. So you have the debt, you have the infrastructure, you have the financial capacities. Everything is in deficit, and that is why we should help them. The world should come out hard, strong, with only a fraction of the trillions. You know, you used to talk about millions, and we used to talk about billions. Now it's the trillions. You know, with a fraction of these trillions, you could double the ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance. We only provide about 153 billion in total. All the members of the DAC, of the Development Assistance Committee, which provide the ODA, and the OECD is, you know, the institution that services the DAC, that supports the DAC. So we know very well, we count the ODA, and it's with only a fraction of the amounts of the 5 trillion or the 8 trillion that are now dedicated to supporting the consequences of the virus. Today, we could double the amount of ODA and save many, many, many lives.
Mm-hmm. So my final question before we take questions from the audience is just about the future of the OECD, given the existential threat that the virus poses and also the long-running threat of climate change.
Well, you know, you cannot put things in a silo. And as I said, just like choosing between the economy and health is a false dilemma, because you have to fight the virus. You have to beat it. You have to win the war against the virus. And the sooner you do that, the easier or the less onerous, less expensive it will be to recover the economy and get the jobs back and get the SMEs back, etc. So it's not a question of a choice. You have to work on both, because you have to work on fighting the virus while at the same time you are fighting the consequences in the economy of the virus, like employment and companies, etc., and whole sectors that came to a standstill. So that is very important. So again, don't put things in a silo. It's not so easy. And does that mean that we then just focus on COVID, on the virus? No, absolutely not. We don't forget partly because of the virus, but today there are 1.6 billion children that should be in school and are not in school. What are the consequences of the, what are the consequences, what are their performance on PISA, our tests that we do every 3 years where we rank all the countries, etc. So you're talking about education, what's going to happen with the taxes, what's going to happen. So this is going to mark our work for some time. But again, the medium and the long-term questions of development, the medium and the long-term questions of growth, the medium and the long-term questions of fighting inequalities, of going for inclusive growth and going for sustainable growth, meaning the planet will still be there after we finish the fight against COVID, and the planet will still be there for the saving, or not the way we're going these days. So let's not forget about the fact that we have that medium and long term. But every day we will continue to work out on all the deliverables that we have. And we will continue to provide, our motto is better policies for better lives. So we will continue to provide our recommendations of how you should go about things and the different policies, practically every policy, every public policy, except for defense issues or military issues. And again, I would invite you to take a look at a website of what we call our digital hub, OECD coronavirus, where there are now more than 50 different briefs about different public policies in the face of the coronavirus. So having said that, the world is not only about the coronavirus, it's just that our attention today has to be focused necessarily on that, because that's the immediate enemy. But we have to beat it as soon as possible so that we can then continue working on the other more substantive issues, which have to do with well-being, which have to do with the quality of life, which have to do with a better life, as our motto goes.
Thank you, Mr. Gurría. Turning now to audience questions, we have a question from Duarte at St. Peter's College, who asks, you have been very vocal on reforming the international tax system and fighting tax evasion, money laundering and corruption, and have led the OECD's contributions to that end. How do you see the OECD's current and future roles in this, and what are your views on what lies ahead, considering the economic downturn?
As I said, we have to focus on the immediate task at hand, not lose sight of the medium and long term. And I'll give you, because he mentioned something about the taxes, for example. We have now exchanged information among 139 countries or something like that, about 50 million bank accounts worth 5 trillion euros. Now, this is about 1/3 of the economy of the United States or something like that, just to give you an idea. That means that in the hands or in the desk of the Turkish tax authority are the names of all the Turkish citizens that have accounts everywhere in the world, in all these 139 countries. In the desk of the Mexican tax authorities are the names and the details of the accounts of all the Mexican citizens that have accounts in all over the world, etc., etc., etc. So 50 million bank accounts and worth 5 trillion euros. Now, this is what we call automatic exchange of information. Before the crisis, we didn't have this. Now we have it. And then what are we discussing about today? Big headlines. How do you tax the digital economy? Because, well, some of the companies that are involved in digital activities have used the legal ways in and out, to actually create a very, very low taxation or no taxation environment for them. So we're only asking them to pay their fair share. That's all we ask, like everybody else, like every other company, and to pay it whatever they generate the profits, which is another pretty basic principle, which doesn't exist today. It's not happening today. So for the question of digital taxation, we've been working on this. So transparency, fiscal transparency, we never had that. Just a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable. And today it's happening. These exchanges are happening, full transparency about these. And of course, what do you think happens when people know that your name is going to end up with a taxman no matter what? Oh, they go to the taxman and they say, oh, Mr. Taxman, there was an omission, in my office. They forgot to send the brown copy or the yellow copy or whatever, and therefore I didn't declare. So what can we do about it? They say, well, then enough people are doing that the taxmen all over the world are declaring these kind of tax opportunities to normalize, to update your tax situation. Just out of that, more than 102 billion euros have been received by the countries involved so far. So just that is become a very important source of additional revenue. But now we're working, as I said, with the digital. So the people who put the question, the person who put the question was talking just about the taxes. Now, future of the OECD, the role of I'm talking about taxes, and that's a project for the next 3 to 5 years. Simplify taxes, make it easier to pay taxes, but also make it fairer, more progressive. But when you talk about education, well, again, you're moving from all the way from daycare centers all the way to universities and research and skills. So all the range. That's a full-time job. Just we could be doing just that, And then what do you do about SMEs? What do you do about regional development? What do you do about tourism? What do you do about entrepreneurship? What do you do about the digital, the question of artificial intelligence, the use of all these instruments like the cloud and the use of all the data? What do you do about the world of data? How do you face the world of data today? And so on and so forth. You just keep on and on and on and on. And if you look at all the areas of the OECD today, you basically are looking at the kinds of things that are going to be relevant going forward and that are going to be in everyday's concerns going, in the future. So I'd say we have our work cut out for us.
Thank you, Mr. Gurría. That is a really insightful place to end on. Thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been a pleasure to host you.